In the world of horror, few characters are as instantly recognizable as Count Dracula. What began as a novel written by Bram Stoker in 1897 has evolved into one of the most enduring figures in cinematic history. While many actors have graced the silver screen in their black capes over the last century, it is Bela Lugosi's portrayal that has left a permanent mark on popular culture. His performance redefined the vampire archetype, shaping how Dracula, and vampires in general, would be perceived for generations to come. F.W. Murnau's silent Nosferatu 1922 has certainly stood the test of time, but it's the 1931 Universal Pictures classic that truly cemented the image of Dracula we all know and love today. Even though it was the first talkie adaptation, there is still limited use of background music, making Lugosi's voice more hypnotic to audiences. The slow, deliberate way he enunciated words, particularly his famous line,
"I never drink. Why?"
contributed to the supernatural and sensual presence he exuded on screen. With Todd Browning as director and Carl Freund as cinematographer, they helped sculpt and define the art of Gothic horror in film. Lugosi's Dracula was a stark departure from Max Schreck's grotesque and monstrous Count Orlok in Nosferatu. Rather than sharp, rat-like features and a hunched demeanor, Lugosi played a suave and handsome aristocrat who brought an elegance to the role. When we think of a vampire, we typically picture dark, slicked-back hair, formal attire, an Eastern European accent, and a seductive yet menacing charm, attributes that have become the foundational image of these immortal bloodsuckers. Bela Lugosi was more than just an actor playing Dracula. He became the character in the eyes of the public. He was typecast to play sinister, villainous roles in films such as Murders in the Rue Morgue, White Zombie, The Black Cat, and The Raven for the rest of his career. Despite a limited variety of roles, Lugosi never took for granted his vampiric fame. On a transatlantic voyage, he was asked by a reporter if he was done with the character, to which Lugosi answered, "No, Dracula never ends. I don't know whether I should call it a fortune or a curse, but it never ends." He went on to reprise his role of the well-loved Count only once in 1948 in Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein. Lugosi understood that Dracula was more than a role. It was a legacy. He set the standard for nearly every vampire character that followed suit. Christopher Lee's portrayal in 1958 was a tribute to Lugosi, bringing an air of elegance, yet carrying a commanding presence. Like Lugosi, Lee relied on intense eye contact and a hypnotic gaze. The main departure from the 1931 classic is that Lee introduced a raw, animalistic ferocity that had not been seen in the Count before, baring his fangs, snarling, and lunging at his victims in moments of bloodthirsty rage. In 1979, Frank Langella took on the role, drawing inspiration from Lugosi's theatrical presence and deliberate speech. Though more overtly romantic and soulful, his performance clearly paid homage to Lugosi's groundbreaking work nearly 50 years prior. Even lighthearted and comedic interpretations, such as Count Von Count from Sesame Street, Grandpa Munster from The Munsters, and Drac in Hotel Transylvania, exaggerate Lugosi's thick Hungarian accent and regal attire, solidifying his legacy across multiple aspects of pop culture. The entire vampiric lore owe their respects to Bela Lugosi. Because of shows like Buffy the Vampire Slayer, True Blood, and The Vampire Diaries, modern audiences continue to perceive vampires as both seductive and terrifying. We idolize these creatures of the night, looking past their monstrous tendencies and giving in to their lure. Had Lugosi not implemented this shift from the balding, rodent-esque Count Orlok, would writers and filmmakers ever created vampires to be charming? He was essentially horror cinema's first sex symbol. Lugosi paved the way for a larger movement, the golden age of universal monsters. Dracula's success led to the creation of other memorable Universal classics, such as Frankenstein, The Mummy, The Invisible Man, Bride of Frankenstein, The Wolfman, and Creature from the Black Lagoon. What makes the Universal monsters so unique is how over time they've come to be viewed with a sense of romanticism. Unlike modern horror, which often leads into blood, gore, and the shock factor, these classic monsters embodied a tragic, almost poetic depth. Audiences feared them, yet they also found themselves sympathizing with them. This romanticization has allowed these characters to endure in ways that other contemporary horror villains have not. Alongside Frankenstein's monster, Bela Lugosi's Dracula was the face of Universal horror. While Universal Studios may not have invented horror cinema, they pioneered it in Hollywood and proved that these films could be big box office successes. We may see these old films as tame now, but in their time, they were considered terrifying, controversial, and were even subjected to censorship. So why did Universal turn to horror in the first place? Well, like many things in Hollywood, it ultimately came down to money. Unlike the Big Five, MGM, Warner Bros., Paramount, Fox, and RKO, Universal did not own its own cinema chains. As a result, it had to rely solely on rental fees for their source of income, whereas the major studios could generate additional revenue from ticket sales and concessions at their own theaters. So horror films became the answer. Not only were they cheaper to produce, but the studio could hire lesser-known actors instead of big-name stars. Carl Laemmle Jr., who was the head of production for Universal Studios from 1928 to 1936, was a fan of Gothic horror and wanted to take a chance on Dracula. This gamble proved to be fruitful, as the film's success not only provided financial stability, but it cemented Universal as Hollywood's studio of horrors. At the heart of this triumph was Bela Lugosi, who brought the perfect blend of menace and charm. His authentic Hungarian accent, calculated movements, spellbinding speech, and unwavering gaze worked in tandem to make his role more memorable. Without him, Universal's experiment with horror may not have achieved the level of praise that it did. He held the power to turn a humble film on a budget into an overnight commercial and critical sensation. His body language and the presence he naturally carried with him is what ultimately set him apart. His character of the Count would lurk around in a slow yet predatory fashion and stalk his victims in the shadows, all the while blending into the night. Lugosi would utilize his cape for dramatic effect, such as to partially obscure and reveal his face, accentuate his movements, or to even suggest his transformation into a bat, where he would wrap it around himself to imply metamorphosis. It is now 2025, and 94 years later, Bela Lugosi's face is recognized by almost everyone who knows Dracula, even if they don't know his name. His iconic image graces a wide array of merchandise, from clothing, apparel, and accessories to posters, prints, and stickers. Online platforms such as Etsy and Redbubble feature an extensive collection of handcrafted items that showcase Lugosi's Dracula made by independent artists. And as modern portrayals of vampires continue to evolve from one generation to the next, Lugosi's spirit remains alive and well, a true testament to his enduring contribution to horror cinema.